one more thing. It's
Yeah.
a question that's Penn State related.
Mhm.
Penn State versus Ohio State in a few weeks.
Ooh.
Do you think that Penn State has, let's say, a coin flip chance to win? Like, not just a chance, because they've always
I'm
had a chance, but like a legitimate shot to break through and like win
It's really tough.
big.
That's really tough because this team is there's so much cohesion offensively. Like they all 11 players know exactly what they're doing on any given play, and all 11 players on that Penn State offense are invested in running the football effectively, which is a big thing. I mean, even Drew Aller on some cutbacks and stuff is throwing blocks. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I'm gonna say right now, I'm honestly leaning towards like a 55% chance Penn State, and I'll give you the reason why real quick. Going off of scheme and stuff here. Jim Knowles, and we saw this in the Oregon game the other night. Jim Knowles really likes to stay in that. It's not really nickel. He plays with kind of like three true safeties on the field a lot. And that's obviously an answer to the modern day college football game where teams are throwing the ball all over the yard, right? Penn State will run the ball down their throat all day with Tyler Warren as in his H back in those wing T kind of formations, in those T formations with both running backs in the backfield. Now I don't know if is it Singleton or Aller that's injured and dealing with something right now. I don't know if they'll both be in that
Singleton.
game. Singleton. So, but Penn State also has wide receivers for the first time. And it seems like every game there's a different one that's stepping up too, whether it's that Amari Evans kid or Julian Fleming had some great catches in this game against USC, the Ohio State transfer. So Penn State, what they do schematically to me is the most interesting thing in the game offensively because they will run two tight ends. They'll run 22 personnel and they will get Jim Knowles out of his base defense. And that's not the Ohio State defense with all the best 11 players on the field because you're taking out a Jordan Hancock or somebody like that and subbing in. The linebackers on Ohio State's defense are really good, but they're not as experienced as the rest of the players on the defense. So that's a really interesting schematic matchup to me. And Kotelnicki will pull out everything in this game, I think, too. We saw Tyler Warren came in as a center on one play against USC and then ended up catching the 37-yard touchdown or whatever it was. I mean, it could be a really interesting one. It could be really interesting. I will say that Ohio State is still the best roster in college football. They're still uber talented, and I don't know if the Tom Allen Penn State defense is better equipped to handle Ohio State than what Manny Diaz's were. So on that side of the ball, I'm iffy, but I really like Penn State going in that game from an offensive standpoint, I will say.
Thank you. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I honestly liked Ohio State more in what they did against Oregon than what Penn State did against USC. But I made the prediction in about August where I thought that Penn State would pull it off for the first time since 16. And I have not seen enough to necessarily deviate away from that. I haven't. I mean,
Yeah.
especially with how Penn State beat USC, I don't know if they have the same ceiling that I thought they would
Mm-hmm.
have. But now I know for a fact they have they have some resiliency, because if they just
Yeah.
went in there and blew them out, I mean, maybe they wouldn't need resiliency, but we wouldn't exactly know. But I think we know now. This team has a little bit of a different gear. Franklin's very coordinator dependent. Luckily, I think he has an elite staff.
Mm-hmm.
Defensively, Penn State plays pretty bend but don't break, which is kind of
Mm-hmm.
the opposite of what Diaz like to do, where it's all or
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think Ohio State will be able to score points because they did against Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
But against Ohio State, I'd rather go bend but don't break than all or nothing, because they have the
Yeah.
athletes to make you pay
Oh,
in all or
absolutely.
nothing. And that's what they've
Yeah.
done to any defense that does that. But bend but don't break, you force them to be slow, you force them to
Mm-hmm.
be methodical, you force them to think and to have endurance. And like you
Yeah.
said, with their two tight ends and with their receivers stepping up and all of that. With it being in Happy Valley, I would, yeah. That's why I asked the question, because in my
Yeah.
mind, when I see people say who are the best teams in the country, or who's your top four, top five, and no one except for the polls for whatever reason are listing Penn State, or everyone's saying, well, Ohio State will see Oregon and Indy with
Hmm.
no mention of the Penn State game. It's
It's
interesting to me.
crazy how overlooked it's getting. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not an automatic win. It's
No, not
not.
at
I
all.
mean, last year's game, if Franklin doesn't abandon the run after the first quarter, they may have beaten that team in Columbus. They
Hmm.
didn't, but they averaged like 2 more yards per carry, factoring out sacks, than Ohio State did. They just completely abandoned the run for reasons that I don't know, but
Yeah, it
they
was
did.
wild. Yeah, and it's good bringing it up too. The last couple of years were much closer than people give it credit for. I think it's just a lot of I don't want to call it lazy or anything, but it's kind of the kind of basic heuristics we rely on as college football fans. We think in kind of short terms of what do we see on a year in year out basis from each team, and the gag, the joke about Penn State coming into the season is they're a perennial 10-2 team. You know, they can't beat Michigan, they can't beat Ohio State, but that was, speaking of Michigan, that was the thing about Michigan coming into 2021, right? And things can change. And
Yep.
similar to Jim Harbaugh coming out of the COVID year, James Franklin has completely overhauled his staff. They've overhauled their personnel in some ways. They got AJ Harris in the transfer portal, the corner, who had a big interception a couple of games ago against, I think it was against Illinois. So yeah, I really think that there's, for the first time, there's an interesting schematic matchup there. And I like that you bring up the defense, because Tom Allen's defense, I think, is more equipped for at least slowing down Ohio State. And it's got to be the Mike McDonald 2021 Michigan kind of game plan in a way, where you kind of keep the lid on the offense, make them drive the field, try to get field goals instead of touchdowns in terms of stopping Ohio State. But then you look at quarterback, and again, like we talked about, Drew Aller's playing really great. I think he's in the top 5 in completion percentage or pass efficiency or one of those metrics so far this season.
Oh
And
yeah.
he's throwing the ball further down the field. So they're throwing the ball further down the field. They're getting more yards per attempt, and the completion percentage hasn't dropped off.
Yeah. And that's kind of when I watch that Oregon game where I'm thinking Gabriel's better receivers, but Aller has a stronger arm and he has more upside. And if Gabriel could fling that ball deep, and if his receivers could get behind Ohio State's DBs,
Yeah.
like if Penn State can do that with the rushing offense that
Mhm.
has looked disappointing in the past 2 games, but
It
we
has
know that it
been
has a
challenged.
ceiling.
Yeah.
If he can do that, that's not going to be good, because Jim
Mhm.
Knowles, whether it's last year or this year, ever since that 2022 year, I have basically only seen them bring 4 guys forward, if less.
Mhm.
They're very conservative,
Yeah.
very bend but don't break, and for whatever reason against Oregon, it didn't, like, they bend but don't break, and they broke nearly every time outside of that 4th and goal, which was
Yeah.
still schemed properly. Gabriel just didn't see his receiver. So,
Mhm.
based off of how things are going right now, I don't know if I'd straight up favor Penn State, but I've seen nothing to change my opinion from the preseason that Penn State would pull off an upset.